Confirmation from the Correctional Services Department that former President Jacob Zuma's jail term has now ended. Begin our senior politics reporter Ziyanda Ncgobo, who's been tracking, in fact, Ziyanda, the end of a 15-month sentence. What is the department saying?
So they're basically confirming what we knew, that he's a free man. And, I think they're just trying to clarify any confusion that there may be regarding the medical parole and the pending outcome from the Supreme Court of Appeal. Perhaps the reason why there may have been a bit of confusion is because, of course, as a part of the application that's been made by AfriForum, the DA, Helen Suzman Foundation and others, is to say, in particular, the Helen Suzman Foundation wants the Supreme Court of Appeal to firstly uphold an earlier decision where there's a part where they had requested that the time that the former president spent outside on medical parole not be counted as a part of the 15-month jail term sentence, or the jail sentence rather. So, which would mean then that there is still a possibility, if the Supreme Court of Appeal upholds the earlier judgment, that the former president could go back to jail. And
just worth noting, of course, because we're basing this confirmation of the end of the term on a statement from Correctional Services, the department and the former president are actually on one page as far as him having been granted medical parole rightfully.
Yes, so in those, hearings earlier on in Bloemfontein, you would have heard then, the Correctional Services Department really being wrapped around the knuckles and ankles about whether or not the former president is terminally ill or physically incapacitated, which are the two factors upon which you could actually grant medical parole. And one of the things that the justices were actually really probing then, the lawyers representing the Correctional Services Department, was to say, well, how are we supposed to make a determination on whether or not then, Arthur Fraser's decision was lawful and rational if we don't know still at this stage whether or not what condition he faces, because the medical records, part of them are redacted. So, and it's very interesting that the former president is expected to be in court, but this time on the other side in relation to his attempt to privately prosecute Karen Moore and lead prosecutor on the Armsdale trial, Billy Downer, regarding this issue of the medical records, where he says his medical records were published unlawfully so, and yet you have in the court where they're arguing that they don't know enough about this. So this is where things stand. So it frees up the former president to possibly and most likely re-enter the fray when it comes to politics of the ANC.
And worth noting, that just of course, on the issue of the medical reports and how much is known, how much was leaked allegedly, that has to do with the corruption trial, and this was to do with his contempt of court matter, which is now, settled because he was sentenced, but still ongoing because there's still that back and forth as we sit here about whether proper process was followed, etc. But let's go back 15 months. When the former president had been sentenced, there were days of waiting to see whether or not, I remember you and I were on air for hours, waiting to see if he would indeed surrender. And then details emerged of long negotiations where I think a senior police official in KZN even traveled to Nkandla to plead with him to actually hand himself in.
Absolutely. I think it was Major General Nonhlanhla Zulu, who formed part of those negotiations. And I think part of what needs to be noted from a political perspective is also just the shift in his influence and power from last year, where he had almost somewhat of a martyr status, where there were scores of people who were outside his Nkandla home, as you said, waiting to see whether he'd actually go. Eventually was arrested on the 8th of July. He was in the Escort Correctional Facility, and we know the July unrest that unfolded thereafter, versus now, where you have a former president who, yes, he's released and he's made a pronouncement on who he'd like to become president at the 55th National Conference, and he was snubbed by his former stronghold. So insofar as that perspective is concerned, it's quite significant. Insofar as now that he's a free man and what he could possibly have up his sleeve ahead of that conference, it's a very interesting change in the dynamic of the landscape.
How significant is that change? Because the KZN ANC had pretty much spearheaded the defense of former President Jacob Zuma. I mean, the singing of Wenzenu Zuma, What Zuma Done, became a popular KZN slogan at the time, but now He's nowhere on their list for election come December, but he himself has issued a statement telling us who he would want elected.
Yeah, I mean, firstly, he issued that statement even saying that he's willing to become national chair, but of course the step-aside guidelines in their current form would not allow him to stand because he's still, he's charged formally with that arms deal matter. But absolutely, I mean, you know, when you speak about how significant it is, it's going to be very significant given how he's thrown his weight behind, you know, Dr. Nkosazana Zuma, who comes from KZN. You have a Dr. Zweli Mkhize, who the PEC has already pronounced as a candidate. So this may split the province going into Nasrec again, which some would have said is a mistake that they're making again, where the province is not united, rallying around a certain candidate, and they'll come back empty-handed. So the former president, now being free, he doesn't have to report to the Correctional Services facility anymore about his whereabouts. He's free to engage with the branches.
Receive more visitors for tea.
Receive more visitors for tea. Whether or not they will follow his wisdom and guidance is also, you know, something completely different altogether. And it has been seen as a betrayal on the part of the KZN PC for not backing, you know, Dr. Nkosazana Zuma. But then perhaps he could hit the ground running and things could significantly change between now and the 16th of December when that conference gets underway.
A long couple of weeks ahead. Ziyanda, thank you very much for that. Updating us on the breaking news, the official end, according to Correctional Services, of former President Jacob Zuma's contempt of court sentence. 15 months it was, but he spent most of that at home, out on medical parole. The grounds or the basis for that release still being questioned through a formal legal proceeding.